Hello, everyone, and welcome back. I'm astrologer Elsa Wadsworth, and I'm here again today with astrologer Martien Hermes, and astrologer David Fisher. We're here for part 2 of our interview with Martien. So if you wanted to go back and watch part 1, this is your cue to do that, where we kind of start with a little bit of history. And then we are going to do a part 3, which is going to focus a little bit more on Martien's work. So if you want to, and today, of course, we're going to be focusing more on Schmidt and Schmidt's bodies of work. So if you want to ask Martien any specific question about his work, you can comment below, and I will try to filter it into part 3 when we interview Martien about his work. And then Martien, you do also have a YouTube channel and a Patreon. So your YouTube channel, is it just your name, or can you tell people where to find your work?
Oh, you just type in Martien Hermes and then you'll find the YouTube channel. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being back with us today. This is very exciting. I'd say part 2 is really the meat of like what brings us 3 together. Of course, we love your work, Martien, and we wanted to do the gossipy history that we get a little bit in part 1, but Schmidt brings us all here together and kind of was the catalyst for this interview. So today is going to be really juicy. I'm very excited for it.
Okay, great.
So to jump right in, I wanted to start us off with some basic questions, but just to get the ball rolling, really. So first of all, how did you meet Schmidt? How did you come to his work? What attracted you to it? Can you tell us again? Because I remember you said something about it last time.
Yeah, I did. Yeah, well, I came into contact with Project Hindsight actually right from the start in 1994. And I was alerted to that by an advertisement and a small talk that Karen Hamaker did. She's the Dutch most famous astrologer. And she was talking about that project, and I was intrigued. So I thought, and I was becoming a bit critical at the time about psychological astrology, simply because I thought there was a shift happening when you want to help people simply by counseling, which I was doing a lot. Then astrology sort of moves to the side and is no longer needed. You can simply ask persons, where does it hurt? And then you go on from that. And the astrology sort of came second place in that sort of consultation. So I started questioning, well, because it almost seemed like everybody was being taught to be a counselor for other people, and the one side of the population is counseling the other side of the population in the world or in the Netherlands. So I was a bit discomforted by that. So I was starting to be critical about psychological astrology and the way that it presented itself as the most evolved form of astrology that is at hand. And sometimes people even do that nowadays. So I was critical about that, and I started reading up on ancient literature, and then Project Hindsight came along, and I was really intrigued by it simply because there were translations about works that were not very well known at the time. At this moment that we're now living, there is a great abundance of ancient material being translated by Benjamin Dykes and Robert Schmidt.
Speaking of which, oh my God, not to interrupt you, but I was about to say this, but then you said Benjamin Dykes. The Firmicus Maternus translation just came out, so everybody rush to get your coffee. It's very exciting. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, not to be sidetracked, but I'm intrigued by that because Schmidt was a bit critical about the Holden translation because let's say he made some mistakes in interpreting what was actually written there. But okay, so I'm also pretty curious about the new translation by Benjamin. So
I am curious as well. It's going to be great. So to dive in, so there's Project Hindsight, which Robert Schmidt was a part of. They maybe say like the 3 Roberts. We have Robert Hand, Robert Zoller, Robert Schmidt, and then Project Hindsight itself was what?
Well, it was a project designed to translate as much material that was available in different languages by people who could translate that material. So Robert Schmidt was the one who was able to translate ancient Greek material. Robert Hand and Robert Zoller. Zoller had already translated Latin material from Benatti. And Robert Hand also, I believe he went back to college to study Latin to be able to read all these texts. So these three people really connected. And I'm not quite sure if there was a Sanskrit track. I'm not quite sure, but there were three tracks happening: the Greek track, the Latin track, and another one which I forget right now.
It was Arabic.
Sorry?
I think it was Arabic.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, you're right. Yeah. These three main languages having a lot to do with astrology, of course. So, yeah, so that was the main idea. Robert Zoller left after a year, I believe. Who was it that said trying to get astrologers to work together is like herding cats?
Yes, it's
Almost
like this.
It's almost impossible, but okay. So, and then later, I believe Robert Hand and Robert Schmidt had sort of a falling out with each other, and then Robert Schmidt started the translation series and continued it as not our Hat, because that is from Robert Hand. So they did the Project Hindsight, and they went on producing translations for it. So
Yeah,
that's,
and if you want, I'm sorry, go ahead. Finish.
no, that's it. Yeah.
And if you want like a deeper dive, I think we cover some of just like the history of Project Hindsight and the whole kind of thing in video 1. We're just kind of catching you up if you happen not to watch it, but I would recommend you go back and kind of get that history going. But the reason why I was asking is because we're going to try to get today to, you know, Robert Schmidt's work and how we find it today, right? So like, I guess there's recordings. We have a website, which we'll link below. Robert Schmidt's work kind of comes in 2 parts. There's the translations, which were used in these tracks, in these like learning tracks, in these translation tracks that were, some of them were finished, some of them were rough. And Robert Schmidt did not get to complete his work on the translations. He left his body too soon. But what we do have, which I'd say is like it was a huge inspiring body of work to me, is the recordings. So can you tell us a little bit just about like what we have today of Schmidt's work and the recordings? What do we have there?
Well, there's actually sort of a divide in all these lectures, because before the year 2000, he was, as he said himself, he was trying to throw philosophy at it as much as possible and try to see what stuck in the astrological, because a lot of people were thinking that the astrological writers were leaning on other philosophical principles or other philosophical schools. And again, around the year 2000, he had a whiff that it was actually a system all by itself, all on its own, and that these astrologers were actually quite good philosophers, but they hid all their material inside the cryptic formulations of what they were talking about. So you cannot find any philosophical statements, except for perhaps sometimes in Valence. Sometimes he refers a bit to Stoic philosophy, etc. So Stoic philosophy was long thought to be the main support for all this astrological work. But Schmidt was really of the opinion, and he doubted about that very much, but in the end he simply embraced it, that all this astrological speech and all the things said in them were actually strongly Platonic in origin. And in the end, he really did something very bold for a lot of people, and also very much debated, that he thought that he had found a person who we now refer to as Hermes Trismegistus, being Eudoxus of Cnidos, and that he thought that he was the founder of Hellenistic astrology in the way that he found it in the text. and he restored it by means of trying to understand what is this system, why everything is connected together, everything is connected, sounds great, right? But that makes this astrology quite complex and also pretty heavy in trying to understand it. So, but he was really focusing on that, and he was trying very hard to get that across in his later work. So
yeah, because the timeline that I have here, even to question, as I was trying to put together questions for you, was, you know, Schmidt's work and then Schmidt's later work and what changed between the two. So thanks for kind of like getting us clear on that, because, you know, in the, you know, and maybe not even in the chronological order of the way Schmidt gave his lectures, but I want to come to this. I want to come to the cosmological model, not just the lecture, but sort of how he set us up with that. And then, you know, there's another thing that I'm aware that he did begin to speculate, or even try to put forth the idea that there was one person. Maybe at first he said maybe it's a school, maybe it's like a milieu that it came out of. But then he did start to speculate that there was probably one person, this Eudoxus Hermes, that was kind of the founder of completing and putting together the system.
yeah.
So that's interesting. And I want to come back to that, like when
I wanted to talk a little bit about what you were saying, Martien, in terms of philosophy, and in terms of this is a difficult thing to grasp when you're first coming into it. So before we dive into the actual Schmidt material, as you're saying now, so I would like us to have this open this box of why is it for the modern mind so difficult to interpret these texts in the way that Schmidt did to come about these results, because when he explains it, it's crystal clear. He makes his case very strongly, right? For these concepts that he unearthed. And when you get into that as someone, like for you personally, for instance, when you came to Schmidt's work, did you have any philosophical inquiries, like or epiphanies? Did you have any not life crisis? How do I say this? Not life crisis, but identity crisis. Did you have like that? Or how did it go for you?
Well, my crisis led to the realization that the things that I first thought of as being psychological or psychoanalytical, I realized that the questions that I had about that, or people in general have, are actually philosophical questions. So when I had my crisis, the first thing that I started reading was the French philosopher of existentialism. Because existentialism is simply about the fact, well, you are here, you're thrown into this world, and you just have to make do. And that was, of course, my first encounter with another sort of philosophy than the philosophy that I read, of course, in the New Age literature, which is all about evolving into a better person, and the evolutionary astrology is rather big on that. But as I said in the previous talk, I did I had a small a talk about does the world really exist in astrology? Simply because when you're talking about projection, which is very big in Jungian astrology, then you're actually saying that everything around you is simply a manifestation of something in you, and however deep that may be. When you try to understand that as something that is simply all in my head, then you can get really crazy. So there are a lot of talks about you create your own reality, etc. And however much that may be true, there's also a world outside that sometimes differs with what you want to create for yourself. So that was actually the crisis that I had, having to do with my firstborn daughter, was really let's say, a confrontation with fate principles. So I had to be smacked in the face by fate to understand what astrology is actually about. So ancient astrology has to do with a sort of realism that I found lacking in modern astrology. And of course, because nobody had warned me about what might happen with my firstborn child, I was really disappointed in the modern take on astrology, because there was no language to address something like that. And when I started reading ancient astrology, there is very much and very subtle principles going on, having to do with how reality sometimes interferes with what's happening in what you want for yourself or what you want for a client. So, as you said before, Elsa, that is validating for people. It's validating something that has really had a big impact on somebody, that it did on my life, and that validates the experience, even though the experience in itself is not pretty or nice or very pleasant. So that's something that really struck, and that has to do a lot with fate. So there is a saying that goes like nomen est omen. Do you know that? Nomen, your name is an omen. So that has to do a lot with numerology. But after this happened, and I realized, well, what does an astrologer do? An astrologer is actually a merchant in fate principles. So he's trying to explain to his clients what his or her fate is about. So then I changed that saying into magisterium est omen. Your profession is your omen, because I also joked a lot about that, but it has to do with when you choose a certain profession, then everything that's important to you will simply happen in this profession. So you choosing a certain profession, and you do that when you're very young often, well, everything will simply come into that profession to confront you with everything that's needed for you to deal with. So yeah, that's what happened to me, because then I realized, oh, this is what an astrologer does, or let's say a traditional astrologer is doing. He's formulating the fate concepts for the clients and trying to make that clear to them how this is functioning. And it can be very subtle and it can be very rough at times, but it's, well, that's life, right?
Yeah, and then even the rough part, like, is validating. And to that validation, I found that classical astrology for me was even more validating, even in the quote unquote psychological sense, as you said, because it doesn't sort of leave out that psychological part of us, because it's created in the cosmology, it's in this philosophy. So it really does factor for that piece of us that needs that psychological validation.
Yeah.
So I wanted to, when I first start, talking about Schmidt, let's say to a newbie, right? And I'm like, where do you start? Who is Schmidt? What is all of this? I think about, and this is not in chronological order, but let's say someone cannot dive in, or they think that they can't, maybe they become addicted and they dive in, but they maybe can't, they don't know where to start with the body of work that Schmidt has. So we have so many of these lectures, right? And hours and hours and hours of these lectures. So, for me, I kind of would say, there's some places where if you want to get a taste of Schmidt's work, listen to A, B, or C of the lectures, right? Okay. And David and I both will tell newbies to start with like the cosmological model, or maybe the image in the original, or something like this, because they give these pieces that could allow you to understand Schmidt's work and give you a place to where if you liked those, maybe you would dive in. Do you have those? Do you have, and then maybe you could, and maybe you could speak a little bit to maybe not just the lecture of the cosmological model, but maybe Schmidt's cosmological model and the way that he sort of presents it.
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure. I believe I said that in the first interview as well, but the cosmological, well, it was actually the fate principles. Look at these pretty ladies behind me. The fate principles have to do, I was very impressed with the way he described how the places, the houses, got their significations, and then the house triads. And that really blew my mind, because it was such a logical and such a well thought out principle explaining why the ninth place has to do with vision and with whatever is associated with the ninth place, as a factor having to do with the 10th place, having to do with action. So the ninth is what guides action. And these things really spoke to me, and they were so important for me. So that led me to the idea that there's a 3-tier model going on, having to do with the principles and That's what's called archetypes, and that's how I formulate them. These are simply the planets and the zodiacal images. These are the principles, and they have very vast descriptions, so they can mean all sorts of things. But then they step one step down, and then they become bound by fate principles, because, as I always explain, I have a crab ascendant, which simply means that the crab, as a cosmic principle, steps down and gets a function in my chart. So the crab in my chart needs to represent the first image, and that has certain qualifications. It represents specific items in my life, and that's a task of the image of the crab. So it's sort of limited. So the multivalent principles of each image gets a task and gets confined to a specific principle in the natal birth chart. So that was my first hunch for, oh, that's a very interesting concept. But below that level, there we have the world. And the world is represented by everything that simply happens, because that's the place of coming to be and passing away. And that is something that the high schools of philosophy at the time could not address, because they thought, well, it's changing all the time, so there's nothing specific you can say about it. You can simply say that it all changes all the time. I'm thinking about this quote by Heraclitus. Everything flows, nothing stays. There's a very interesting Greek saying, but I can't remember it right now. Kai Ude Menai is the last person. Pantarai Kai Ude Menai. Everything flows, everything changes, nothing stays. So the astrological model is simply there to address that principle, because in a natal chart you can see that it is always changing, but it's fixed at a certain moment, your birth time, but everything changes. So when you're born an hour later, everything is in a different place. So it's always changing all the time. So that what I've found that was really brilliant of these philosophers, to be able to address that issue that was so looked down at by the other schools, to simply have a method, have a principle to address the ever-changing stuff. So I always say, well, there is a general principle of human beings. We have male and female, and you can in general talk about that, and that is what typifies everyone of us. But what makes us specific is everything that happens to us. When you're born a female, you have quite a different life than male persons do. And the place where you're born has a very big impact on who you are or who you can become. So fate principles is actually that thing that's individualizing us. So that really ties very neatly into all sorts of modern notions about how we come to be and pass away, simply by developing all these principles. And they are so neatly described in a natal chart that you can actually talk about them as the things that makes you, you, and me.
And by making yourself, actually, astrology then becomes such an interesting tool, right? And a deep form, when you practice astrology, becomes really a deep form of spiritual work, because you're not, it's not religious per se. It doesn't have a goal with a god, but it is a kind of activity. It's just like exercising your body and having your immune system improved, or your resilience grow, and things like that. Like your body becomes more resistant.
Right.
When you do astrology and engage with those principles that you're mentioning, meaning you put your mind, you stretch your mind in these directions that the chart suggests, which could be areas that you don't generally think about in your life in the way that the chart suggests. By doing that, you become conscious of your own patterns and of your own environment in a way that allows you to have even more power over what happens around you. And when I say power, like you're still subject to everything that fate has to offer, but when you are aware of what's going on around you and why in that way, you're much better able to cope. You're much better able to go through the ordeal if it's a challenging situation or something like that.
And I would argue you even have a little bit of agency there, right? Because then you can kind of like play with the versions of the archetype, or at least your response to the archetype, because you have more awareness around it. So that's kind of beautiful. I want to back us up just briefly for, I'm just being the mind of potential, viewers. The angular triads, is this something, first of all, I could explain, or someone can explain what these are, and then with Schmidt, as far as your experience, the first one to put this forward, or do you know if it was put forward prior to Project Hindsight or Schmidt? Yeah, can you speak to us about what the angular triads are? Just a brief synopsis, of what we're talking about there.
Yeah.
A lot of people think that it goes like first house, second house, third house, and that's one quadrant, right? That's the normal division that we have nowadays for people to think about, but that doesn't really mean anything. No. People think that that's the sequence, right? So if you could explain, Martien.
Yeah. Well, the interesting thing is that addressing the idea that this was probably also introduced by other astrologers, that might be, there is a very vast amount of research done in the German literature, but I'm not familiar with that, so I'm not sure if that perhaps was addressed in these analysis by German astrologers or German researchers. What is known is that the idea of whole sign places was pretty early on discovered in the work of Vetjes Valens and perhaps other authors as well. And Schmidt really focused on the idea of we nowadays talk about angular places, and I always ask my listeners, where do you find an angle in a round chart? Where do you find an angle? You cannot find an angle because it's a round chart, right? So then we are talking about Kentra. The word Kentron has to do with what we now call pivots in the traditional astrology. I call them often Kentra, or the central images. And these all have to do with movement that is changing. And that has to do with the ascendant. That's a Kentron. That the 10th place is a Kentron. And the reason for that is that the ascendant, there is something changing in the ecliptic, because there the invisible part of the ecliptic rises above and becomes visible, which is not quite true, simply because it simply ascends into daylight and then you cannot see the ecliptic anymore. But in the 10th place, there the rising portion of the complete ecliptic starts going down. And it is these movements that Schmidt found in the words of the Kentra. Kentron simply means a
hinge.
A hinge, thank you. That's what it is. It's a sort of a hinge. And the word cardinal images comes from these words, right? The cardo is the Latin translation of pivot, a hinge. So there the ecliptic changes. Now, what's going on is that these places are called central places because a pivot is where something central moves around it. Now, there are always two places, two houses, two images flanking each Kentron, and that's for the 10th image, it's the 11th image and the 9th image are the houses. Let's call them houses for sake of our listeners. So
and we are actually, we are going to address the language model, and I'd like to probably address that after this. Feel free to continue to use the language, but yeah, so
yeah, it needs to be explained.
We can break it down. So use whatever language you want now, and we'll break it down just after this. So if you guys want to stay tuned for that, we're going to break down kind of the language model we're using.
Yeah, okay. So we take the 10th pivot, and there are always two very important movements going on. That's the movement of the same, which is the diurnal movement. And the movement of the same is very interesting because the same represents that everybody is subject to that movement. It's the movement of the same, and it's the diurnal movement. So it's going from the ascendant to the 10th place to the 7th place, etc. This movement is very important. That's the prime movement. The second movement is a zodiacal movement, and that's the motion of the other, as Plato called it. And that's the movement in the zodiacal order. So an image has 30 portions, degrees. So each planet is moving from 0 degrees to 30 degrees, unless it's retrograde, but that's a different story. Now, these two movements have to do also with the places, the images, the houses now, as we now call them, because when you have the 10th place is circling, that's a central place. So you can also say when a planet is there, it is very central in the life. Everything revolves around that planet. But what revolves about that planet is the 11th place, the 11th house, and the 9th house, because those are flanking. Now, these two movements have to do with that, because in the 9th place, the zodiacal movement, the counterclockwise movement, is moving towards the 10th place. But the daily motion carries it away. And these two movements have a lot to do with how these principles are functioning. So whatever is going on in the 9th place is with reference to the 10th place. It has to do with action. And as I said earlier in this talk, the 9th place has to do with what guides the action. It pulls the 10th sort of over the peak, which is the place at the peak, right? The 10th image. Then the 11th image, the zodiacal movement says that the planet is moving away from the 10th, but it's carried away by the diurnal motion back to the 10th place. So the friends having to do with the 11th place are the friends that are supporting your work and supporting your standing in society.
Right?
So that is your network, as we call it in the Netherlands. So that's one of the angular triads. You also have one with the first place, which has to do with the second place and the 12th place. That's the triad. The central one is the first place. And the interesting thing is that the topics that are associated with all of these images are always refer to the centron that is the center of each angular triad. So that's a very important principle and explains why these topics got their topics. If I may, for instance, Valent says that there are 5 places that have to do with friends. So it's the 3rd, the 5th, the 7th, the 9th, and the 11th. So when you're talking about friends, how do you differentiate them? Well, this is very interesting because the 3rd and the 5th have to do with friends of the family, perhaps, because the 4th is a center. The 7th is simply friends in general. And the 9th place is the friends that you and me. We are now friends because we are studying astrology, right? That's a 9th place topic. And the 11th place friends are the ones supporting you getting through to your life. That's the reason why children were also associated with the 11th place. Because in older days, you were hoping that when you had many children, they would take care of you when you got older. That's
as well as maybe help build your reputation in some sense as well.
Or take over the family business, right?
Yeah, and so this angular triad, which I think you put so beautifully, thank you for going over that. And we could go on about this, and I'm sure Martien teaches it through his Patreon or even his free videos here on YouTube, which are amazingly thorough and well taught. So thank you for those, Martien. Okay. So then we have these angular triads, which is what gave us sort of the quote unquote house or place system, and in some of how we interpret, or a lot of how we interpret those houses. So you have the first house with the 12 and the second flanking. You have the 10th house with the 11th and 9th flanking. The 7th house with the 8th and the 6th flanking, and then the 4th house with the 3rd and the 5th flanking. And these are referential points to the pivotal moment of the angle, essentially. And I'm not sure if I was given this through Schmidt, but I feel like when I was taught this, at least my impression was that I was taught this as a trickle down from something Schmidt put forth, or something like this, right? Like I really felt like it was very influenced by Schmidt in his work.
Yeah, it is. And it was strongly based on the fate issues, and fate issues have to do with, there was this fantastical metaphor, which is the nautical metaphor, which also blew my mind, but it has to do with the idea that your life is actually you being at sea and you're in a boat, that's your body, and you're trying to reach a certain port. So you're steering your boat as best as you can, but you're also at sea. So things happen there. You can run aground somewhere, or you can have a shipwreck, or you can have a storm, or there's no wind, so you cannot move forward. So that's all the things that might happen in our life. Again, this principle of you are here, and you have, of course, free will and whatever, but you're also here. So you're also at sea. So you're also, sort of victim of circumstances that you cannot always foresee. And that, again, is also such a very, very proficient metaphor to try to understand what our life is actually about. And
I know that was like a major aha moment. I was like, David and I remember freaking out about this, because it's like, you've got the helm, and it's like the ship metaphor, I think, works perfectly when you're trying to talk about, fate to someone. So you're like, okay, you're a ship captain and you're at sea, right? And so, like, if you go to an astrologer who can talk to you about fate principles, it's like, yeah, no one wants a storm or to be like knocked off course. But wouldn't it be helpful if you were told that there was a storm, or that you were off course, or something like this, right? And so then you can sort of like know your surroundings to know like what the proper way to sort of adjust to that would be.
And not only that, but imagine you're choosing a particular person, and you are an astrologer, to do a certain job, to be a captain over a certain ship. If you have a chart for the inauguration of said ship, and if you have a chart for the captain and they don't match, why would you choose that captain? In a sense, why they don't match? Like, if you see that the fate principles involving those two vessels are going to suffer through some kind of, like, together, you put that captain there and you see that there is an accident involving the boat and the captain's chart, or something like that, some difficult situation. The captain's chart is probably going to describe a course of action and reaction to those circumstances that is going to be very inappropriate for what that boat has to offer to deal with those circumstances. Right? Same thing, like if you were someone born with a very rare skin condition in an that makes you extremely allergic to sunlight, and you were born in one of the sunniest places on earth, like that's a hindrance. That's a huge hindrance that you didn't choose, and you're going to have to cope with for the rest of your life.
Indeed.
And now, talking about these topics, like, this is life. We're talking about the way that the ancients understood life, and in Western society, the way that they understood life has come up before in big ways. And I'm talking about the Greeks here, the ancient Greeks of the Hellenistic times. They came up in the Renaissance with the works of English astrologers, European astrologers, thinking about Lilly in specific, a little after that period, or still within that period. Using that classical material to bring about these questionings about life again. And now we see, would you say that we are in a new renaissance of astrology, or that astrology could usher in a new renaissance in the way that we think in society because of these materials that are coming up?
Yes, I do. Yeah, I think it's happening already, because there is so much translation going on now. So the ancient principles are so well put forward now, and are so available to everybody who simply wants to take an interest. So I think, anybody wants to try to study astrology will inevitably be confronted with this material as well. And then you have to choose, you like it or you don't like it, and then you go off in another direction with your astrology, which is fine, because we can now deal with more issues and more questions having to do with life in general than perhaps when you were simply a psychological astrologer. Again, it's great for psychological issues, but the things addressed by the ancient astrology were much more realistic. I remember that one of the first time I realized how potent this was had to do with the death of Gianni Versace. Our famous astrologer wrote an article about that and said, well, we will probably never be able to really see in a chart when somebody might suffer a violent death. And then I had just read Morin de Villefranche, who has a very interesting, and also I believe it was Bonatti, Robert Zoller, right? And he had a sort of 10 principles that you could investigate to see if somebody was perhaps likely to suffer a violent death. And when you, then I looked at Gianni Versace's chart, and he ticked off, I believe, 8 of these principles, 8 of these conditions that might suggest that he might suffer a violent death. So that was really an eye-opener for me. So well, you can have a certain psychological resistance to want to read something like that in a chart, but you cannot say that it was never possible. And that's always was at the time was the major idea. Well, it has never been possible, and it was fantasized by all the astrologers, and well, they didn't know what they were talking about, and they needed to integrate psychological issues that were not available at the time. That's all BS, pardon my French, but it was simply there. I also read in a little booklet by Robert Zoller about the principles having to do with begetting children. And that in the Middle Ages, that was very important because people who were in power wanted to have offspring, so that the realm or whatever they were managers of would be could be furthered and could be remain in the family. So, but he also talked about I forget the right word, but it was about investigating whether or not the child would live. So, and that's also something, well, nobody now would simply want to do that simply offhand, but that it was there simply refers to the fact that there were very almost scientific-like attempts to try to get to grips with the childbirth, but also children dying very early, because when you were a king, you wanted to have a healthy offspring, so the kingdom, the realm would stay in the same family, right? So that were things that were really out of the blue for many of my astrologers at the time, and I found them very interesting simply because they were there. So there was so much knowledge that I had never heard of when I started reading ancient astrology, and I thought, where the hell did all this material go? Why does nobody know about this? Why did my teacher not tell me about this? Because it simply wasn't known. And now this Renaissance that you asked about, David, it cannot be untold, right? We cannot say, well, it's not there. Yes, it's certainly there, and it's very proficient in all this literature. So we need to do.
And that being said, with Robert Schmidt, just a quick statement. Robert Schmidt being the father of this material, being the one basically the brain fathered this whole thing. Again, like he translated it to our modern minds and allowed us to have a glimpse into the ancients' minds, right? Because he did, again, the dance of learning ancient Greek, or when you learn a language, you think like the people that taught that use that language. It's very important to highlight. You're not just translating your own language into another. You are talking in the way that other people talk. Therefore, you're feeling in your body the kind of expression that they're making. And so when Schmidt got so familiar with the Greek language to the point where he was able to examine these texts, and because of his knowledge of mathematics, bring about all of this knowledge, would you call him an astrologer?
Well, he always said that he came into astrology because he was not an astrologer, and his lens on astrology was from the principles that he was reading about. And at the time when Project Hindsight started, he always met people who were trained in modern astrology, and they were looking at the ancient astrology through the lens of what they were taught. And Schmidt looked at modern astrology through the lens of what he read in these texts. And as I said, I believe I said that in our first interview as well, he was very surprised by the fact that because he was reading ancient Greek for almost all of his adult life on a daily basis, and when he met when he started reading these astrological texts, he was quite stupefied by the fact that it seemed so complex, because they were so difficult to read at times, and they were so weirdly composed that he at a certain moment thought, well, either these were very stupid people who could not write decent Greek, or they did it on purpose. And that last principle really inspired him to investigate this further. And interesting,
considering that not just a stupid bloke would have access to pen and paper in the ancient times,
yeah,
easily conclude that they were doing it on purpose.
Yeah, they did it on purpose. The interesting thing is that he had done this long before he ever got into contact with astrology. He said he was fascinated by ancient material that was never complete, that was almost lost, and then he tried to restore it. And he did that for Francois Villette. That was I believe, a mathematician in the Renaissance, etc. You probably have heard about that, but it's a quote in a book by him, the first Definitions and Foundations. That's by Francois Villette, and he also attempted to do that, and he did that long before he came into contact with astrology. And in the end, he simply had to embrace the idea that might have been all sort of preparatory work for what he was doing now with Hellenistic astrology, because it's such a great project to restore all this material and try to get to grips with and restore it. And that's what he always says in lieu of all the criticism that he had. This is simply what the texts are saying. It's not what I'm saying about astrology, but this is what the texts are saying about this astrology. So
yeah, and his interpretation of that, like, you know, he does talk about like the multivalent layers of the language, and you know, for as much as we can think a million things about Schmidt or whatever, but we do know that this work that he put forward in the other Roberts and Project Hindsight and everybody that was involved at that time really did have an effect on this new, quote unquote, like Renaissance, if we can call it new, or like what we have access to now. Because for whatever it's worth and whatever criticisms, he was at least trying to translate A and then B, put together a cosmological model, or put together like at least like, let's think this out, and like this is my way of putting it out, or this is what I think. And like I feel like Schmidt kind of encouraged us to think about it and do that also for ourselves as well. And I feel like that's where, you know, maybe like his students, Demetra George, Chris Brennan, Benjamin Dykes, you know, we talked about this last time, is they took a torch and interpreted it in the way that they could and did with his work what they want or what they could, and they're still contributing to it. And so in a way, like whether right or wrong or indifferent, like he inspired me and you know, through a lot of our teachers, you know, that I just mentioned, to kind of like put thought into this. And so whether or not you find holes or flaws or whatever, I think by listening to Schmidt's, whatever he's going to lay it out as in just how he lays it out, sure, if people want to criticize it, or if they find holes in it, or if they want to add to it or whatever, to me that's kind of beside the point, because at least he's like translating and trying. And to me, he says like, let's just look at this for what it is, and this is kind of how I'm laying it out, or how we could think about it, or like he puts together a model, a cosmological model. He hypothesizes on what the multivalence of the word could mean, and how we find it in history, and how the Greeks might have looked at it, and how it fits into the model of astrology that we have. So he does a lot of this like foundational thinking in his translations and in his work. So just to back up just for a second, if you were to say, okay, you only have access to Schmidt's work for a couple of months because you can only afford to pay for the subscription for a couple of months. Because on Schmidt's website, there are some of his translations, written translations available, as well as all of his audio, or most of his audio lectures, let's say. If you're to say, okay, you want a taste of Schmidt's work and you have a month or two to listen to something, how would you point them to approach the work? As far as like certain talks, certain philosophies, would you start chronologically with them? Like, how would you say to approach Schmidt's work if you were to investigate it?
It's pretty vast, but I would certainly advise people to listen to the principles where he's laying out the 3 or 4 approaches, the universal approach, the topical approach, and the Time Lord methods. That's a very important one because that is sort of ordering all the material into specific issues, because I was not quite aware that there were delineation principles having to do with life in general. So, for instance, the triplicity rules have to do with periods of life. And the first 2 divide the life into 2 periods. The first period you can typify as being good or moderate or bad. And then there's a second one, and that you can address that issue as well. So is there a bettering, or is it getting worse, or is it staying the same? And that's life in general. That has nothing to do with something specific. It's simply about life in general. And there are 7 methods of those. So I would point people to that, because when you want to study this material, this is a very important thing to know. The difficulty is that not everything is quite crisp and clear about what it's simply addressing. But I've talked about the 7 hermetic lots, which is simply also a principle of a general idea of, for instance, when you're talking about a lot of nemesis, Saturn, then you can interpret this as, what do you do when situations are really pretty desperate and there's actually nothing you can do, which is a Saturnine principle, a lot of nemesis. How do you cope with that? And then you look at the domicile master of where this specific hermetic lot is. And that also has to do, for instance, the lot of diamond is very important, because that has to do with the sun, the Helios, the sun. And what does the sun do when you look at the morning, where you are now, both, I believe? When the sun comes up, what do? You get out of bed and you start doing things. Action. That's the principle of the sun. Everything wakes up, nature wakes up, the birds start whistling, etc., etc. You wake up and you want to do something. The lot of the diamond has to do with what inspires you to take action coming from the outside world. And how you do that is represented by the domicile master of the lot of the diamond. So that's also a general principle, and that was such an eye-opener for me, because it really addresses something that, well, that's hardly available when you simply keep interpreting charts from the natal position. You also need to introduce these things. And the second one, I'm really very much in love with the image and the original. That is such a deep talk on the principles having to do with Platonic astrology, which is really mind-blowing. And the more technical one is the one about the configurations and aspects. It's a difficult one. It's not an easy one, but it's a very clear one. And what I like very much about that is the idea. He did evening lectures, right? And there's one on maltreatment, and that's also such a gem to take into account and to learn about what this actually represents. And it's such deep material that, because it has to do with afflictions, right? Maltreatment is such a much more better idea than affliction, because an affliction can mean anything, right? Because it's so broad and so general. When you have a difficult aspect from Saturn, then that other planet is afflicted. But what does it actually mean? So, and when you have the maltreatment conditions, then you get pretty specific information of what's happening with that planet. So,
do you remember the lectures in which he talks about the 4 like planes of interpretation? Do you remember what series that's in?
Yeah, it's addressed in the talks on Einstein. The Einstein lectures, he did a very extensive weekend workshops on each of them. So the topical approach, the universal approach, and the Time Lord methods.
Okay, yeah, the Einstein intensives. Okay, so that's where people can find those. And I guess image and original would be a little bit more philosophical. And then the zodiacal releasing and Einstein lectures, yes, they have Schmidt's sort of like philosophical underpinnings laid out in them, but he's also going to give you how it works in technique.
And it's beautiful. Like when he goes through zodiacal releasing on Einstein's chart, you just get that feeling of, oh my God, I see how Einstein was being motivated on each time. And when he talks about the not mutual reception, but when he talks about the reception that Saturn has in relation to Jupiter in Einstein's chart, and of course they are in images that are in a sextile, so they communicate with one another. You really can see how the planets work together through time. He's like, oh, so because Jupiter is received by Saturn in that way, when the times of Jupiter come about, when the times of Saturn come when the times of Jupiter come about, since Saturn is the one that is most prone to action in Einstein's chart for being more active in an angular place, all of that. When Jupiter came up, Jupiter would do the Saturnian dance to allow Einstein to do his work that he needed to do through Saturn. So Jupiter was Jupitering, was doing the thing of support to what Saturn wanted to do in Einstein's 10th house, but it was through isolation, through Saturnian means. It was through denying Einstein things that he wanted and delaying them so he would have enough time to work on them properly many times. And so this is the level of, just to give you guys a level, some of the level of detail that you can get with simple factors within a chart laid in the system.
And David, if you can remind me, I think, another thing besides the ship metaphor, and if people wanted to, sometimes I like to say, okay, the introduction to Schmidt, if you're not like a hardcore astrologer, like all these things like zodiacal, releasing Einstein, yes, please listen. If you're an astrologer, absolutely. But just as a introduction to who Schmidt is, you've never listened to his work, we do like cosmological model, the image in the original, absolutely. But David, is it discourse on method where he really dives into the legal paradigm that you can use?
Yes, no, it's not discourse on method. It's translating ancient astrology into the modern
idiom. Yes.
That's a recommendation as well. That's I really like the idea of the he tried to translate it to modern principles.
The outer planets, it's amazing.
It was really, really amazing again.
So modern idiom.
Honestly, I use his model.
I did a workshop
nowadays
because it was such a beautiful principle. Wow. But when you try to do it in practice, then it becomes more difficult because the theory is clear, crisp and clear, but sometimes it's pretty difficult to see it working in a natal chart. And that had to do, I tried to do, for instance, well, it's perhaps too technical to go into that, but I tried to do it with the chart of Vincent van Gogh, which I'm also using at the moment to in my Patreon. It was quite difficult to find the idea of the MC having to do with the place where you're going. So the aspects are sort of hints of way signs pointing you in a certain direction, right? That's your understanding as well? Because that's how we interpret the MC. The MC is where you're going, the road that you are on, and the bound ruler of the road that you are on is simply telling you where the bound of the road is, sort of. And that's theoretically, that's really beautiful, but I find it quite difficult to put it into practice, but I'm still working on it because it's, again, with the judicial metaphor, the nautical metaphor, and this is also, you think, wow, this is opening so many levels of new information for people to address in the consultation. That's, as I always say, simply mind-blowing. And that's what I say about Schmidt's work all the time. It's mind-blowing.
Everybody, like literally last night, someone was like, my mind is blown. I'm listening to this. My mind is like blown. And I'm like, yeah, I know. And they're like, oh, I mean, really, my mind is blown. And then, also in the study group that we have. So it is. And so that's what I'm saying, like before, and two things here. When in the next interview with Martien, we're going to be going over Martien's work. So it's going to be a lot more like fundamentals of like practice, because we have a lot of questions to ask you about like how you use these things in your practice. So maybe and potentially we can go into some of those technicalities there. Like we might be able to drill down on like how these things can be used. But if you guys want to do a quick brush up before that interview or something like that, or if you have questions on it, please comment below. And then also, these are places for you to start with the material. So there's some ways in which he asks us to look at things. And then you also can see his work and how he uses it in charts. And I guess those would be kind of recommendations on where to start. And then we can.
Sorry.
No, and then we can just look at how we work them in practice when we look at Martien's practice and Martien's work and how he puts these Schmidt things to work. Because if I'm not mistaken, you use like Schmidt as a primary teacher and in how you do your astrological work, your professional work. Yeah.
We want to see like reason why we're doing this. And if you're enjoying this content, please give it a like, share, subscribe to our channel, activate the little bell for when we post anything. We don't even post it that regularly, so we're not going to flood your timeline or anything. So please engage with us, because we're trying to make this a community thing. We're trying to make people aware of the workings of Robert Schmidt and bringing people like Martien Hermes in to show us how you have developed, Martien, your own way of working with that material. Because as we were discussing, Robert Schmidt was not necessarily a practicing astrologer. So a lot of what he uncovered was mind-blowing, and it's particularly useful nowadays. It's very useful for the astrological practitioner. But there will be a lot of questions left unanswered, as you were saying, in that material, because he didn't have that practice. So it's going to be really interesting to dive into what you do in your dating.
And I also
with those lacking concepts, or how you get around them in your consultations to try and investigate them.
Yeah.
And I also feel like, it's because his life was cut quite short that we don't have a lot of those like fundamental answers from him, but we do have some really primary questions, some fundamental questions, and some ways of thinking that he's developed. So I love what you said. And then also, I just want to say, I would argue, maybe he wasn't seeing clients, right, as a paid professional astrologer, which is a much different scenario, of course, which we all are. We all have a client practice, right? So there's that. But I would argue, or I don't like the argument that Schmidt was not an astrologer or not a practicing astrologer, simply because he was. Now, was he taking clients as a primary source of income? I don't know about that, and I don't think so. But when we're talking about like he goes through Einstein's charts and applies the principles, to me, that's a practicing astrologer. So, so I just want to say that, because sometimes people are like, oh, Schmidt, he's just a translator, he's just a mathematician, or he wasn't even an astrologer, right? So
no, to me, he's closer to the OG astrologers than any of us,
Do you want to talk a little bit about, like I have noted here, ancient names and metaphors, as well as like the language that you seem to use and carry on? So I wanted to just talk a little bit about like house, place, image, and how, Cancer versus the crab, or things like this. Can we talk about a little bit about like this?
I want to introduce this topic, perhaps suggesting that we talk about how, broadly speaking, nowadays we have a difficulty of using language in the way that these ancients were trying to do when they named things the way they did, and why we're trying to translate to more multivalent terms nowadays instead of using what we already have in modern astrology. So, yeah.
What would be the benefit of using it? Let's lay out what it is, why and how we use it, and maybe the benefit of using place versus house or something like this.
Well, that's an easy one, because in ancient literature, the place where the image where a planet is at home, its domicile, and that's a house, right? The domicile of a certain planet. So Aries, Mars, is domiciled in the Ram and in the Scorpion. So that's their domicile. And in the modern notion, that's a house. So when you talk about house in ancient literature, you're actually talking about the images and not the places. So that's the reason, for instance, for changing that. Now, Robert Schmidt was really big on trying to formulate things as logically and anthropological as possible. So he also, I also use the idea, when you go outside and you ask somebody what is an aspect, and then people will probably look at you and say, oh, I got no clue, and walk away. But when you talk to somebody and ask them, what is a witness? Then people will certainly understand what you're talking about and can explain it to you. So that's the word that Schmidt used, a witnessing, for the word aspect. So that is a different way of understanding what's actually happening. So the word itself explains what it's talking about. And that's really helpful in understanding what astrology is about, because when you use the word aspect, you have to explain to all your pupils what the word aspect simply means. But when you say, well, this is a witnessing, then people simply understand what you're talking about. And then the idea is pretty clear. So let's do that. The word Zoidion, he had a t-shirt that said TSTI, I believe. What is a Zoidion? What is an image? What is a sign? What is it? Because the word sign is not a right interpretation of the word Zoidion. So he came to the Platonic term, it's a representation, it's an image. It's not a sign. An image of, for instance, a statue of some person is not a sign of that person. It's simply a representation of that person. So again, it makes it more obvious and more clear to you when you read these words and when you're taught these words. And
So,
again,
what I hear you saying is that you have this ancient doctrine or the ancient practice when you're writing that allows you to give meaning from the text, like explain to the person what the text means by using certain terminology that the reader would be familiar with in their daily life. But that has a reason behind it. It's not just making someone like nowadays familiar to a new concept and trying to explain a list of significations to that person so they can memorize in some way.
Yeah, right.
The ancients liked the experience of it. And so if you read, like you're saying, witness, your own experience of what a witness is would play a part in it, but it's still a concept that is general to everyone. It's not just some random word that has to be explained, right? When you say it, it evokes a feeling of experience, action, and truth in the soul's in the soul of the person.
Yeah. And we see this like, you know, even in the concept of like a square, a triangle, saying a triangle versus an aspect or something like this, which, you know, and I'm not going to get too deep into that. But what I did want to say is like when we're studying valens with one of our friends who's a Greek scholar and we kind of go through word by word, we're taught as, you know, scholarly translators that if you see the same word 5 times in a sentence, maybe vary the word that you use to translate it. You know, that would be a good scholarly like way to do it, because you're using, I guess, synonyms or different things to kind of like make the reading more palatable instead of just using the same word 5 times in one sentence or in one paragraph or something like this. So then when you're reading through valens and you're seeing, it's actually the translator, let's say, would use 5 different words in 5 different paragraphs to describe actually the same Greek one word. But it's very interesting as an astrologer to go back and see what that one word is, because there is a rhythm and there is sort of a science behind why we would, or not a science, let's say, there is sort of like if you're looking at it as through the lens of an astrologer and you see that it is the same word, then you would have a piece of correlation that allowed you to see like, oh, it actually wasn't these 3 different meanings. It was actually this same word the entire time, right? And so I think there's definitely something to the way we use that language and how it's sort of interpreted. So I think maybe like what Schmidt at least did for me is looking at the multivalence of the words and using, you know, like I think Achuta, Adam Ellenboss from Nightlight Astrology would say, you know, it's actually more correct to call them places, or even like thinking of them as like temples. So it's like when you think of a place, like when I think of a place, I think of like the desert is a place, the beach is a place. And then when you say it like that, you get all of these sort of like qualities of like what the desert is or what the beach might be or something. This swamp is a place, right? But when you think house, you kind of have almost this more boxed in like linear perspective of like what you think of when you think of a house, right? And to me, place even opens up your mind and your interpretation more to the qualities of what that whole area might be like, and not just a house in the desert, for instance.
Right. Yeah.
So I hope that made sense. But yeah, so I think the language that we're using has meaning, and so we are, and Schmidt does, and you do kind of carry on that language, right? So we've got like place instead of house, okay, and then we have the domicile. Can you sort of continue to take us through a little bit more of what that language is that we use?
Well, I keep slipping up myself all the time, but I'm talking about the images, the signs I refer to as images, representations, and the aspects. I try to name them in the tetragonal, hexagonal figurations, the sextiles and the squares, etc. And the places, the houses I call places mostly, but I also slip up sometimes. And sometimes for the purpose of a lecture or something, I just keep the old words because these are most familiar, and then I don't have to go into a rant about, well, that's actually not a quite sufficient term, but well, that's for a study group like this. Well, I'm not quite sure. Well, the lots, that's a difficult one because the word lot in Dutch actually means fate. So that's difficult to use in the Dutch readings simply because the word lot has a different connotation than in your language. So that's a fate word in Dutch. So then I keep talking.
That's quite nice. It's quite nice, isn't it?
Like the term, right? The word term for bounds and confines. The word term itself is a designation of the word that you use for a certain principle. It's called a term in Dutch. So there are a lot of technical difficulties in trying to translate from one language to another. And that's the reason why I keep trying to use Schmidt's translation for the bounds and the confines. And the bounds, etc., I call in Dutch the domain of a planet, because that's where it's actually ruling. That's also an interesting thing. The domicile master is not a ruler, it's the host of the planet visiting. These are so important to get.
Important.
Much different. And again, we're in the beginning of defining these terms. Us as a community, we have these people who established the language because they were the ones who translated the material. But it's important for us to create a familiarity to the terms that we are using in a way as to integrate what we are talking about into our understanding of how that functions in our own lives. And in that note, following up to the end of this episode, I suppose more towards the closing topics, I wanted to ask you about how using this terminology in your work, how using this in your life, and I know we touched a little bit upon this when you got into astrology, but on today, in the present, how do you see your life, what ways can you notice that you're more aware of what's going on around you, and how do you think that impacted you as a person? Very personal question. You're like,
well, I was more at ease with myself because one of the things in the modern, the way I was brought up in astrology had a lot to do with actually a sort of inherent principle of you have to get better all the time. So you have to work on yourself all the time. And that's one thing that really helped me get more at ease with my own life. So you don't have to work all the time to change this or change that or get better at this, get better at that. So that was really, for me, that was quite comforting because I was trying all the time, you know. And yeah, that's sort of my criticism of the evolutionary idea that you are evolving all the time into something else. But a lot of realizing who you are, simply what your life is at the moment, perhaps that is more enlightening than trying to strive to be something else all the time, or trying to be better at this or better at that, or etc.
You will know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. It evokes that phrase to me when you say that, because it's like when you are aware of reality in a way that allows you to like identify with it, to familiarize yourself with circumstance, with which astrology as a tool helps us do. You are freed from the necessity that the modern world creates in us to always be going somewhere, to always be acting, but in a way that's wasteful, that's like wasting life force, wasting consciousness on things that are not truthful. Again, logos is this idea of putting your mind at ease, because as well, the other signification is that because you bundled something together, like you bundled some idea in one specific concept, and that allows your mind to rest.
And this is a Schmittian, I just wanted to say for people watching, like the language that David's using now is Schmittian language, right? The logos, allowing your mind to rest, right? And he teaches us a lot about these resting concepts.
And when you are living through life with more awareness through these tools, your mind rests much more, as Hermes is saying, in the sense that you don't need to keep wasting your energy on things that you've already come to a conclusion about in your mind. And that actually allows you to live your life better. It's not impeding you from chasing your dreams because you've stagnated and accepted your fate. That's not what we're talking about. It's just like stop using your fate more intelligently. It's like using your energy more intelligently to navigate your fate, right?
Right, yeah. Well, Nietzsche said, amor fati, learn to love your fate.
Yes.
An interesting idea.
So,
it's not always easy, but it's a good approach to things that simply inevitably are going to happen. So yeah, interesting.
It's almost like a remedial measure in a way. It's actually quite liberating. I think it could be. So I guess to bring it, past the language that we're using, we talked a little bit about Schmidt's later work versus his earlier work and what changed. And I think we don't need to totally go into the fact that, he started to speculate or put forth the perspective that it was potentially one person. Is there a time that you know of for someone that's wanting, again, to investigate Schmidt's work or understand how it changed? Like, is there a time in his lectures or in his sequence of work where you can see that happen, like a definitive change, or is it like an evolution over time, or is there like Schmidt's early work versus Schmidt's late work? Do you see any kind of like definite shift in that, or is there a certain talk or lecture where you're like, oh, he really starts to, talk to us about this starting, here or whatever?
Well, I think the divide indeed is at the year 2000. Before that, he was also dealing with a lot of medieval stuff in the delineations, for instance, with the chart of Albert Einstein, the talks he did on the topical approach, the Time Lord methods, etc. That was all pretty comprehensive. Everything that was handed over to us from our past, the tradition that was, he tried to get to grips with that. So he mentioned all the methods that were introduced and that were delivered to us through our history as astrologers, and trying to get to grips with the what was going on in Einstein's chart. But after the year 2000, he went more into the Platonic ideas of how the archetypal principles could be introduced in a Platonic framework, in the sense that it was quite a different, complete method or system that was not completely translated or handed over to the next tradition, to the medieval astrologer and to the Arab astrologers. For instance, the teachings on transits is a very important example of that, because some of the translations of a very early material on transits simply give quite different interpretations of whenever, for instance, Venus is conjunct Jupiter. We would now interpret that as a pretty nice day or pretty nice week in a person's life. but the ancient astrology did not. And Mars conjunct Saturn in transit, we would think of, oh God, that's going to be a bad day. No, the ancients said, no, it will not be. It will be pretty good. The Sweetest Life, I believe it was called. So there are some things happened in the transmission of this early material to the next phase in our history. So, and after the year 2000, he was more interested in trying to delineate and understand what the original system was and is, and how that was, well, abolished somehow, or was forgotten in the tradition later on. And that's also started in the Hellenistic period itself, he said. So
on the website for Schmidt's material, you have this body of work, but you actually, you wouldn't know the chronological order necessarily. You wouldn't know when the talks were given, and which order they were given in.
It's a little hidden, but they are. And I know this because I asked the people on the website. I had to email them and be like, hey, could you give me a chronological order of the talk so I can examine Schmidt's work through it? So she answered me saying the dates are actually in the corners of the first pages of each course, of each lecture.
Yeah.
Yes, I want to also close this just by laying out Schmidt's work in general. Is like, we're talking about someone here in this video that studied Greek, ancient Greek, that studied philosophy, who studied mathematics. He was very well versed in all of those areas.
He was,
very. And then he got into astrology and he applied all of those knowledges to that particular frame of mind, to that particular worldview. And he dedicated the second part of his life, all of it, to this work.
Yeah,
so
he did.
we're bringing what?
Yeah, he did. Yeah, it's
When
his
we're
life
bringing
work. He called it his life work, which
and
is
when we're
quite
bringing
true.
in here all of these things together with Martien Hermes, we're trying to not just exalt our teacher, but we're trying to emphasize that this is someone who dedicated their life to this thing. This is a life's work. And a lot of people just don't respect that. So I'm saying all of this just so people will be careful when they're going through this material, not to think that this is just another piece of astrological work that you can just put on a pile with all of the others. No, this is a one-of-a-kind thing that we have here in this day and age.
It was very inspirational to many of the teachers and translators that you might know today, which is just that, like, you know, take it for what it is, but as well as know that this was like an inspiration to all of our current astrologers in the field. Martien Hermes included, Demetra George, Chris Brennan, Benjamin Dykes, Austin Coppock. Like we said, you know, it's a very influential body of work that inspired this whole Renaissance and a lot of our teachers today. So it is important to at least highlight it, if not get to know it. Even getting to know it just to criticize it is fine, right? But to get to know it well and have these conversations around it.
That's
I
basically
really liked you saying that, David, because it needs to be treated with respect, because it's so profound. And people just cast it aside. Well, it's just his opinion about this astrology or whatever.
like, bitch, do you even speak Greek?
Yeah, right.
Like,
so
not on the same level. We are not the same, you know? Schmidt to those people is like, we are not the same, honey.
And the thing about it, what's cool about Schmidt's work is not only did he inspire our teachers to go back and learn Greek so that they could question better themselves, which is always a good thing. I don't think Schmidt ever said, take this as law. He said, question yourself, right? So that's good. And then also, you know, there's a difference between just translating something word for word, like we talked about earlier, and then really thinking about the implications of a multivalent language or a multivalent word, which would be different than studying Greek for 2 years and just being able to sort of look at a word and sort of know what it says or know what it means. But to really understand the implication of what the language as a whole and the milieu of the time sort of represents, or the multivalence of a word or things like this, which anyone studying a language, especially an ancient language, would know that there's a lot of these like very deep concepts layered in these ancient or dead languages. So, you know, there's a lot to that. So that being said, how do you feel that Schmidt, you know, left us? He left us with an incomplete body of work. He left us with a host of a lot. I have very deep and what do you want to say? Packed, yeah, like a big body of work, a large body of work. And then he also left us with, these teachers that we currently have, and essentially this renaissance that we're in. But how did he leave us? How did he leave us with his work? What is there gaps? What's our responsibility to sort of like work on or carry on, or how did he leave us?
Well, he left us certain questions. One of a lot of things that I really found quite difficult to listen to is that you all have the course that he did, the 4 parts of the course that he did, which was his last work, so to speak. And in each of them, he almost always said, well, I'll address this later in the course. And I felt really bad about that, because it was such important principles that he was about to explain, but he had to postpone them to a later part of the course. So I think our responsibility is to try to understand what he was getting at, because he couldn't explain it himself. So we need to try to get to grips with what might he have implied here, for us to understand and try to discover in all this material. So yeah, he left us at the moment that he was about to really reveal everything that he understood about this complete system of Hellenistic astrology, but he was unable to finish it. And perhaps in a sense, there is always a reason to that, because you often see that in history, that certain events simply stop, or certain discoveries are put at an end because the person who did them passed over. So yeah, I think that's sort of a task for us to, well, let's go seriously into this material and try to understand what this is all about. Because you always said that all these things, all these different methods and everything that's in it is actually working together. One thing that comes to mind is that he said, well, there is I can tell you the way you have to look at a chart, and then you can see how the malefics and the benefics will function in this chart, irrespective of where or how they are located in the chart, irrespective of the images where they're in the fall or exaltation or whatever. Okay, I would have liked to have that. You understand? Yeah, these are the things that, oh my God, what a pity that he passed.
I know. It makes me crazy that we don't have a complete body of work and he passed too soon. But I think he really did what a good teacher does, whether living or past, which is leave us with a lot of very good questions.
Yeah, really, yeah.
And that would be the responsibility to say, like, let's look at them thoroughly, even if it is to deconstruct them or to reconstruct them or to think about them and come up with our own answers around them. I think he really inspired this renaissance that we see, because he was the teacher of a lot of our teachers. And most of our teachers that have inspired a lot of us younger people in the field to become astrologers or be interested in astrology, as well as, gave us the foundation for how to ask really good questions, or what questions are worth pursuing, or how to pursue them and things like that. And I think that's the work of a brilliant teacher, is to leave us with that. And so thank God we have questions to ask and a lot of material to work with for ourselves, and to work with each other on.
And for next time, since this time we went around the ideas of how to work with this material in the modern day, we're going to talk more about the practice, because we are like that here. We like to discuss the ideas and then give them form through action. And Hermes is going to take us through his body of work, like the way he applies that, all of that he's learned through Schmidt and others in his practice. So stay tuned.
Yeah, and thank you, Martien, for putting out this body of work. And what was really interesting, again, to us that we mentioned in video 1, is that when we were introduced to Martien, we saw, we were baby Schmidt studiers at the time, but we saw Martien using Schmidt's language and breaking down Schmidt's way of practice in very true to the way we had heard that we were studying Schmidt, right? So by following Martien's work, you can, or by going through it with us next time when we're going to be asking you, Martien, a lot about how you work, how do you use it, these techniques, it is really exemplifying Schmidt's work. And we will talk about your work and if it differs, how it differs from Schmidt. But that's going to be kind of coming up, is to look at
things like how in a 1 hour conversation or an hour and a half conversation, you could go through those factors with the client in a way that helps, right?
Okay.
Yeah. I guess it's a certain modality of practice and a certain language of practice. So that to say, more to come if you want to see some of Schmidt's work through Martien's work in practice as an astrological practice. That will be part 3. So again, thank you so much, Martien, for joining us and breaking some of this down for us.
Thank you. You're very welcome.
Thank you. Yeah, and David, thank you so much again for joining.
It's a pleasure to be here with you guys.
Awesome. So thank you, viewers. Stay tuned. Tune into Schmidt's work. Go ahead and comment below, ask questions, and we will be back for part 3. Ciao.
Bye.
Matao kako bersama yo demikian soba da soba kena mata iba nak kau di mana demikian soba dan soba ate iba nak ujung baik nak maya tak ongai esa koyo masina mata ibe kana sabaso inna kina tabaine